Warning, the following program may contain coarse language, strong violence, and brief sexuality. This video is designed for a mature audience, and viewer discretion is advised. Childe of Shade Reviews, Review Number 2, Transistor.
Hey, Red. We're not gonna get away with this, are we?
Indies have traveled quite the distance from where their humble roots spring. What were originally little passion projects produced by flowering programmers or IT students are now becoming huge projects where limitations are pushed and creativity falls like wondrous rain in the booming and fierce storm that is the game industry. These independent games are quickly proving to be the future of this industry with critically acclaimed darlings such as Journey, The Walking Dead, and my personal favorite, Bastion. Yes, Bastion, Supergiant's cornerstone establishment that launched them into the spotlight as one of the premier indie developers to look out for. Bastion received a massive amount of critical praise for its phenomenal soundtrack, blissful narration of its tale, and unique and innovative combat system. With Bastion being such a gigantic success, high expectations were to be placed on Supergiant Games' shoulders, and those expectations would flourish in 2013. Where Supergiant Games announced their new game, Transistor. Not much was known about this game at the time other than it would be a similar game to Bastion, with more emphasis on strategy due to a new mechanic called Shift that freezes time and allows players to plan out their attacks. However, that was 2013 and it is now 2014, and in May, Supergiant Games released their second game onto next-gen hardware. Does this Transistor cause a flow that will release the same euphoric senses that its successor had delivered? Or did this Transistor short-circuit on impact? Ladies and gentlemen, tune in and find out. Our story opens up with the heroine, Red, standing over a dead subordinate with a mystical sword-like device talking to her. Red quickly flees the scene and runs into the process, a synthetic race of various mechanic beings that seek to overrun Cloudbank City, the city that Red lives in, FYI, and hastily escapes their grasp. From there, the story mostly details Red's journey across Cloudbank to seek the Camerata, the creators of the process, and try to find answers on why the city is being terrorized by the process. In terms of story, that's about it without going too deep into spoiler territory, but that doesn't mean there's not plenty to talk about. Let's begin with characters by introducing our main leads, Red and Transistor. Starting with Red, who unfortunately isn't a very deep or compelling character, and is somewhat a waste of potential. Besides a couple points where she comments on the current situation at terminals, she doesn't get a single line of dialogue throughout the game. All we really know about her is that she was once an incredibly prevalent and influential singer who had someone who inspired her and made her life worth living. This is made all the more frustrating by how much potential could have been harvested from her. Between the actions she performs in-game and the way she deals with the situations that she's in, I feel that Red was a golden opportunity to provide a character that is different and could be a strong female lead that makes her own choices with her actions. However, Supergiant Games instead opted for a somewhat blank slate of a character that, besides having a unique look and design, doesn't differentiate from the norm quite that much. Up next, there's a Transistor who is truly the heart and soul of the game. Much like the narrator in Bastion, the Transistor is constantly commenting on your actions throughout the journey and providing useful information about the environment. It serves almost as a consciousness of the player and will often convey what you are thinking, whether that be, why is this character doing this, or what exactly is happening. He even gets a couple humorous lines here and there. Overall, I felt that the Transistor was a much better character than Red ever was, and I hope next time Supergiant Games decides to give a bit more characterization to the player character. Finally, there's one last thing I want to discuss before leaving the story segment of this review, which is the Dark Souls take on storytelling, where the developers try to leave certain details as ambiguous as possible. The most obvious example of this is the side stories that come with the abilities. With each new ability, there was a person who had a backstory, a talent, and an ultimate demise. Although these are nice touches, most of them feel somewhat unnecessary to the bigger picture, and while I do enjoy experimentation, especially when it comes to storytelling, I don't think that the Dark Souls method is the best for stories like this. To me, it feels like the developers, rather than explaining what and why everything happens the way it does, they decide to place little pieces of information throughout the game that give a somewhat vague idea of what has happened. Now, I by no means think that Transistor has a terrible story. I feel that the game delivers on some powerful moments, but everything else around it seems a little, well, shall we say, unfinished, especially that ending. It's by no means bad, but like the rest of the game, it didn't feel like it had enough inertia to push it to that conclusion. Maybe if there was a bit more solidarity to the story, I wouldn't be harping on it so much, but it still has some stellar ideas behind it. But I'm looking through my script right now and I'm seeing that I'm taking way too long talking about the story, so let's move on to gameplay, shall we? Mechanics are the lifeblood to any game, and there can be many different kinds that are put into games. It can range from puzzle mechanics to combat mechanics, even dialogue mechanics. So you'll probably be surprised to find out that Transistor only has one mechanic, and that's combat. Besides fighting the process for the majority of the game, the only other objective is to search the environment for terminals and scenery that the Transistor will comment on. Although just having a single mechanic like this isn't a bad idea if you can polish that mechanic to a mere shine, and that's a dance that Transistor does with absolute grace. Combat consists of a plethora of abilities that are given to Red, and these abilities can range from Crash, a short-range swing that is easily spammable and can stun enemies, to Breach, a sniper-like single shot that's powerful but takes a little time to recharge and set up, and other non-combat abilities like Mask, which as the title suggests, cloaks you, and Jaunt, which is a dash. The interesting thing about this is that you are given 4 ability slots, 2 upgrade slots for each ability, and 4 passive slots that you can assign as buffs. So say if you have both Crash and Mask, and if you assign Mask to Crash, it now has the ability to do more backstab damage to enemies. On the other hand, if you assigned it to a passive slot, you'd make it where every time you defeated an enemy, you would go invisible for a couple seconds. Keep in mind, Transistor has 16 different abilities, so it can provide a wide range of different combinations. A circular strike distance that draws enemies in and shoots them to the sky while draining their health? Sure, go ahead. Want a dash that makes you go invisible and persuades enemies to fight on your side for a little while whenever you hit them? You can do that. Along with these abilities, there's a move called Shift, which allows the players to freeze time and plan out strategies for an effective strike against the enemies. The only catch being that once deployed, Red is unable to use offensive tactics for a few seconds while she recharges, which gives the process plenty of time to retaliate. Controls work well during both stages of combat, with my only gripe being that once Shift has been executed, time still goes on, only at a slow pace. So it's completely possible for the player to be told that their combo will do tons of damage, but during the turn, only for the enemy to move slightly and have Red just wasting time, slashing at the air a few centimeters from where the enemy was earlier. Other than that, I feel that the combat is fantastic with its unique variety of abilities and vast customization options. It can even handle player death well too. When Red's health depletes, rather than going to the last checkpoint, one of your main abilities is taken away from you until you reach an access terminal. This can happen up to 4 times, so it gives the players plenty of time to rethink their strategy and encourages experimentation when certain combinations aren't working. Could there have been a little bit more things to do in Transistor? Yeah, absolutely. But if Supergiant Games decides to keep this combat system for the next game and instead opts to focus on storytelling and assets, I definitely won't complain. So without further ado, let's move on to presentation. Having moved on to a new generation of consoles, you think that new games would be focusing on particle effects or 3D modeling or even bigger, more exquisite environments. So you should be surprised to find out that Transistor doesn't focus on any of those things. Instead, it puts all of its effort into at least what I think is most important when it comes to presentation, the art and aesthetic of the game. To put it simply, this is one of the most gorgeous looking games that I've ever seen, and I'm hard pressed to come up with an example of how great this game looks. Blue is the most expressive and fragrant color. There's also uses of darker colors like red and orange. Really, the only 3D part about this game is red in the process, but they're blended so well that you really have to stare at them to be able to tell that they're 3D. The closest example that I can come up for this game is the Persona series in terms of colors, dark hues, and gradients. Seriously, the art is absolutely fantastic, and it rises beyond and above the high bar that Bastion set up for it. The artist for Supergiant Games, Gen Z, should get an award for what she's done here, and as with the rest of the staff for making such a beautiful game. If I did have any gripes about it, I would say that the isometric view can be a bit hard to see exactly what's going on in some combat scenarios. However, I feel that the player has many options on how to get out of a situation like that, and it really just kind of is a small nitpick. Other than that, that's really all I gotta say about the presentation. I think that this game should be on everybody's list for best looking game of the year because it truly deserves that accolade. So finally, let's transfer over to sound. Darren Korb, the composer, first showcased his musical talent for games with Bastion. His twangy and subtle guitar riffs and adding some absolutely stunning vocals creates a calm and upbeat atmosphere with his music. His inclusion in Bastion was one of the many reasons that it became such a huge success, and his soundtrack for it is still playing on my iPod. So you'll probably be surprised to find out I was just a tad bit disappointed by what was put on display here. Now don't get me wrong, I think the music in this game is absolutely brilliant, especially vocal pieces like We All Become and Paper Boats. However, I feel that with Transistor's setting, a cyberpunk-esque futuristic dystopia, that Korb was taken out of his comfort zone a little. While the guitar is still there, it largely takes a back seat to the rest of the electronic music that is being played, which at sometimes can sound somewhat generic. It makes for interesting background music, but like I said, the only music that really stood out was vocal pieces. I personally can't remember a single track that didn't have vocals in it, and can rarely put up memories of the game to their sound either. While listening to the soundtrack on its own, I feel that it's somewhat above average, but for the third time, it's really just the vocal pieces that stand out, and I think they're enough to make the soundtrack a buy. Just don't expect to keep listening to it for several years. Also, it is a nice touch to have the PS4 controller blink along with the Transistor's voice. As for the rest of the folly, it sounds respectable and holds up. Queens and clangs sound like they should, and ticks and booms of the level bar hitting its max point are welcome to the ears. In summary, sound is superb in some areas, but can feel a bit generic in other areas, and for what it's worth, it should still be listened to. For a test of the waters of the new generation, Transistor is a victorious experiment that is definitely a milestone for how far these new games can go. But consequently, I don't think that Transistor is going to be remembered as a forerunner for the new generation. Sure, it has spectacular combat and visuals and can even sound great in some areas, but then again, the story kind of falls flat due to its over-ambiguous nature and its strong but slightly lackluster protagonist. Nonetheless, for a second outing from a fresh indie studio that's produced an absolute gem of a game, I think Transistor is about as sublime as it could have been. Despite this somewhat negative review for this game, I did enjoy Transistor very much. I feel that if it had a bit more polish and a slightly more focused direction, it could have surpassed Bastion. So after applying all those scores and mixing and matching them until they become a long-range sniper shot that stuns enemies and sends them flying, I've decided to give scores to story, gameplay, presentation, and overall enjoyment of the game. Starting with story, whom I give a solid score of 7.25 for having respectable emotional scenes, but leaving a bit too much ambiguity to the player, and a rushed ending. For gameplay, I give Transistor an outstanding 9 for having a deep and intriguing combat system, but nothing else. Presentation gets a spectacular score of 9.5 for being an absolutely gorgeous game, proving why graphics aren't the only mechanism for having a memorable presentation. Sound gets a good score of 8.0 for its solid direction and a handful of appealing tracks. And lastly, there's enjoyment, which also gets an 8.0 for being a captivating yet less significant successor to Bastion. Totaling all the scores up, I ultimately gave Transistor an 85% and recommend that you buy it. For all the problems I had with this game, I still feel that it's worth playing for its combat and art style. It may not live up to the expectations of the studio's previous works, but if you want to play a game that strays from the norm and has a beautiful art style to support it, this is definitely not a bad choice. Keep in mind this review was conducted with the PS4 version of the game, and that the PC version is also available, with both being $20. And because of that, the only way to get a hold of the game is by PlayStation Network or Steam. However, I won't be surprised if this game gets ported over to Xbox One, maybe even iOS, so if you prefer those platforms, you may want to wait somewhere between 6 months and a year. For other game recommendations, I'll obviously point you to Bastion for its similar combat style and narrative structure, and also to the BioShock series, with your choice on what game for their dystopian setting and similar variety when it comes to combat. Between those four, you should find something that will satisfy you. And with that, that's all I have to say. Thanks so much for watching this video, and please leave a comment below about any issues/suggestions to help make this video better. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Childe of Shade, signing out, and I will see you next time.
Seconds march into the past, moments pass, just like that.